I'm speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York, where we have a distinguished visitor, the Duke of Windsor. The occasion of this visit is publication by G.P. Putnam's Sons of the Duke's memoirs, A King's Story. And I should like to congratulate you, sir, on publication of the book and on the fine reviews you've had from the literary critics.
Yes, I feel the reviews have been more than fair, and I'm very gratified.
To begin our talk about the book itself, sir, perhaps you would care to tell us something of how you came to write it.
My reasons were quite simple. I think I had more reason than most men for turning author. Still, I did approach the job with some hesitation. Kings and princes are supposed to be a good deal more reticent than the average person. But after all, it is 15 years since I abdicated, and the controversy surrounding my decision has long since subsided. It should be possible now to get a better perspective on my life and reign. There has been so much speculation, so many rumors have hardened into legend, that I thought it was my plain duty to set down the facts as I know them. Furthermore, by writing my memoirs now, I've had the advantage of being able to check my own memory with that of other people who were close to me in those days, while their recollections were still fresh.
I'd also like to ask you, sir, how you did your writing. Was it, as John Gunther says in the Saturday Review of Literature, a titanic struggle?
Well, titanic is hardly a word I would use myself, but it fits. This book was in some ways the hardest job I ever tackled.
Still, sir, now that the book is finished and between covers, you must be conscious of a deep feeling of satisfaction.
If it has done one thing for me, Mr. Cassidy, it has taught me to respect the craft of writing. Writing represented for me a long and painful leap from the kind of work I was used to.
It was, sir, your description of your princely life that made me realize more than anything else how different was your upbringing from that of the rest of us.
I've come to realize that, too. But at the time, having known no other, I took my way of life for granted. I was brought up as a prince in the 19th century tradition of monarchy. But by the time I was a grown man, that kind of life had all but disappeared. I am now 56, and I myself do not consider 56 very old. But when I pause to consider the changes that I have witnessed in my own lifetime, I am constantly astonished at the changes compressed within that seemingly short span. Today, the younger generation takes for granted such things as nuclear fission, radar, psychiatry, and so many other things I never even dreamt of when I was young. The first 7 years of my childhood were spent during the reign of my great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. As a matter of fact, she dandled me on her knee. To the young people of today, I must seem something of a Victorian relic to be classed with the kerosene lamp and the Prince Albert coat.
Perhaps now, sir, you'd tell us something of your earlier memories. I found those were some of your finest pages, recreating admirably the atmosphere of the reigns of Queen Victoria and King Edward VII.
Yes, when I was born, Queen Victoria was 75 years old, but I can still remember being taken to see her when I was quite small. She wore a white tulle cap, a black satin dress, and shiny black shoes with elastic sides. She was so truly regal that even her own family stood in awe of her. To us children, though she was always Gan-Gan, a childish rendering of the word great-grandmama, I shall always remember the way she took her breakfast at Windsor, Osborne or Balmoral. If the day were fine, she always breakfasted in one of the little wooden huts, of which there were several in the grounds of each of these 3 places. These wooden huts were mounted on turntables, so that they could be faced away from the wind. When the Queen came downstairs, she would find waiting at the front door a small, low-slung carriage with a Highland attendant wearing a kilt to lead the pony. In this vehicle, she rode out to breakfast, which always began with a bowl of steaming hot porridge. Then, when she had finished, she would call for her private secretary and begin dealing with affairs of state.
Then there was quite a change, wasn't there, sir, when your grandfather, King Edward VII, came to the throne?
Yes, he brought an entirely different atmosphere to the court. Decorum had been the keynote of Queen Victoria's reign. But my grandfather liked the more sophisticated and cosmopolitan ways, and I use these words in their best sense. Queen Victoria's long widowed seclusion had left a vacuum in royal ceremonial, and my grandfather had gradually taken over the leadership of society. Sandringham, his country estate in the county of Norfolk, had become the center of the new society of Europe and America. my grandfather surrounded himself with livelier personalities. Rising politicians, international bankers, sportsmen, artists and their patrons, all sharing a common taste for opera, cards, and the turf.
And what a wonderful time Christmas at Sandringham must have been.
It was indeed. Then my grandfather became the country squire without ever ceasing to be the monarch. Christmas was the high spot of life at Sandringham. The afternoon before, we children would be taken to the stables to watch the distribution of meat to the 300 workers on the estate. There would be long tables covered with joints of beef, one for each family. And the gamekeepers, gardeners, and the foresters would gather in the coach house to say Merry Christmas to the King and to receive his present. My grandfather knew them all by name. Then we of the family all repaired to the big house for our own celebration. We would assemble in the great hall. Then the loud banging of a gong would tell us that Santa Claus was on his way. In he would come, in full regalia. He was actually one of the upper servants. And he would give the King and Queen a jovial greeting. Then the double doors into the ballroom would be thrown open, and there would be revealed in the center of the room a big Christmas tree hung with colorful decorations and blazing with lighted candles, so tall that it reached the high ceiling. All around the room were tables heaped high with presents. The children always got theirs last, and for us the suspense was agonizing. But in a matter of minutes, the ballroom would become an ocean of wrapping paper, and chaos would take over as we pedaled and honked around the room in toy motor cars.
To change the subject, sir, I was very much interested in what you had to say about your father, King George V, particularly about his attitude to the social changes that followed the First World War.
My father's outlook upon the world, his manners and customs were fundamentally Victorian. Nevertheless, I do not think it would be entirely fair to say that he rejected the less formal ways of the 1920s. Like a general fighting a rearguard action, he simply held them at bay for as long as he could. Many a time I heard him murmur to himself, "Well, we never did that in the olden days." The things my father found wrong with the first post-war world would have made a long list, at the head of which certainly was the new woman with her bobbed hair and short skirts. He also disapproved of Soviet Russia, cocktails, jazz, and the new habit of going away for weekends. It was a great shock to him when in January 1924 the Conservative government fell, and he was obliged to invite Ramsay MacDonald, the leader of the Labour Party, a socialist intellectual who had been born in a crofter's cottage in a Scottish fishing village, to form a new government. Years later, I discovered in my father's diary what he privately thought of that political upheaval. In his own mind, he was deeply troubled, and he wondered how Queen Victoria would have adjusted herself to a Labour cabinet. However, in the end, there grew up between monarch and that Prime Minister a genuine mutual respect, for Ramsay MacDonald was more conservative than his Labour Party label might suggest. If my father was somewhat old-fashioned and applauded many of the changes that were hailed by my generation, yet he gave ground to many of them with good grace, and even a sense of humor. He was, in fact, highly successful in his reign in adapting the British monarchy to the new conditions.
And then, sir, it was your turn, and in 1936 you became king.
Yes, and it is strange to reflect on some of the stories that were circulated about me. It was even suspected that I inspired to be something of a radical king. Of course, that was absurd. But I did try during the months I was on the throne to let a little fresh air into an ancient and venerable institution. As matters turned out, there wasn't even time to introduce some of the innovations I had in mind, and actually only two very minor ones could be charged to me. One of them was to create a new post in the royal establishment, the captain of the King's flight. This I gave to my personal pilot, and I was not only the first British king to fly, but also to be able to pilot an airplane. The other innovation concerned the Yeomen of the Guard, the famous corps more popularly known as the Beefeaters. Soon after I became king, I learned that recruiting for the corps had fallen off. When I tried to find out why, I discovered with amusement that the wives of the potential recruits objected strongly to their husbands having to grow the Tudor-type whiskers prescribed by the ancient regulations. Having myself grown up, so to speak, amidst a veritable forest of Victorian beards, I saw no point in risking the eventual depletion of the famous corps by adhering to an outmoded form of facial adornment. I made the wearing of beards by the beef-eaters optional, and was gratified when the normal flow of recruits was restored.
You state in your memoirs, sir, that of all the titles conferred upon you, those of which you were proudest were the two accorded unofficially by the newspapers in recognition of your travel on behalf of Great Britain, Britain's first ambassador and Britain's best salesman.
Yes, I suppose I was one of the most traveled men of my time. As Prince of Wales, I made 4 official world tours. In the space of 6 years, I visited 45 different countries and colonies and traveled altogether 150,000 miles, equal to 6 complete circumnavigations of the globe. But in addition to these 4 major voyages, I was constantly traveling on imperial business, either within Great Britain or often to promote British trade overseas. That part of my life, strenuous and exacting as it was in many ways the most interesting and stimulating to me. Great Britain lives on commerce, and happily for me, I found commerce in all its various manifestations endlessly fascinating. Under other circumstances, I might have taken up manufacturing as a career, with what success I should hesitate to say.
Sir, the world knows much about your abdication and the events leading up to it. For myself, I shall never forget hearing you broadcast your farewell message from Windsor Castle on the night of December 11th, 1936. It has been described as the finest speech ever made by a king. Can you tell us something about how it was written?
Many believed that it was composed for me by Mr. Winston Churchill. Well, I shall now tell you how that farewell message was written. During the last days at Fort Belvedere, while the details of my abdication were being negotiated with the government, the idea grew in my mind that I should make a final statement to the British people, whom I had served so long. The first drafts I prepared myself. The afternoon of that last day, Mr. Churchill motored to the fort to lunch with me. He had so often helped me with speeches before that I asked him to read over this last and, for me, crucially important effort. He made some suggestions and supplied some telling and eloquent phrases.
Your description of the scene as Mr. Churchill took his leave of you is extremely moving. I like to think of him standing at your door with tears in his eyes, his hat in one hand, his cane in the other, murmuring the famous lines from Andrew Marvell's ode on the beheading of King Charles I. He nothing common did or mean upon that memorable scene.
Yes, you could always count upon Mr. Churchill to grasp intuitively the historical drama of any situation.
Reading your memoirs, sir, I was deeply touched by the way you expressed your feelings upon sailing away from England the night of your abdication. I wonder if you would read that passage for us.
I believe this is the passage you mean. Watching the shore of England recede, I was swept by many emotions. If it had been hard to give up the throne, it had been even harder to give up Great Britain. I knew now that I was irretrievably on my own. The drawbridges were going up behind me. But of one thing I was certain. So far as I was concerned, love had triumphed over the exigencies of politics. Though it had proved my fate to sacrifice my cherished British heritage, along with all the years in its service, I today draw comfort from the knowledge that time has long since sanctified a true and faithful union.
Looking back upon it all, sir, if you had to face the same situation today, would you make the same decision again?
Happily, a monarch has to make only one such decision in his life. I should not like to go through again the mental and spiritual anguish that I had to endure in December 1936. But for myself, I have no regrets. In my marriage, I have found a contentment that I never knew before. I am a happy man, and in my brother, Great Britain has a fine king.